There is a recording. Most people have never heard it. Not the Lincoln Memorial speech, not the Birmingham jail letter, not the Nobel acceptance. This one is different. It was captured on a reel-to-reel tape machine in a church basement in Montgomery, Alabama in 1956. And in it, you can hear something that the polished, canonized, monument version of Martin Luther King Jr. almost never reveals. His voice is younger. The cadence is looser. He is not performing for history. He is talking to his congregation, his actual people, the ones who walked to work instead of riding the buses, whose feet were blistered and whose backs were tired. And at one point, in the middle of a sentence about dignity, he stops, just stops. And in that pause, in that 2-second gap in the recording, you can hear the room breathing. Then he says, quietly, almost to himself, "We didn't come from nowhere." The congregation answered him. Of course they did. That is what Black Baptist congregations do. They answer, they affirm, they co-author the sermon with their responses. But what is remarkable, listening to that recording in the specific way we are about to listen to everything in this story, is the weight he put on that word. Nowhere. Like a man who has been told for his entire life that nowhere is exactly where his people came from. Like a man pushing back against something he cannot name because the name was taken before he was born. He was right to push back. His people did not come from nowhere. They came from somewhere so specific, so ancient, so architecturally and spiritually complex, that if you placed it next to the civilizations that European history has spent 5 centuries celebrating as the pinnacle of human achievement, it would not merely stand comparison. It would complicate the entire premise of the comparison. But Martin Luther King Jr. never knew where. He knew the general answer. Africa, West Africa, somewhere across the water, somewhere before the ships. The way that every descendant of the American slave trade knows the general answer without knowing the specific truth. The specific truth was buried. The specific truth was, with a thoroughness that approaches the systematic, removed from the record of American history before he was born, before his father was born, before his grandfather was born, in a courthouse in Henry County, Georgia, in the middle of the 19th century, where a man who held his ancestors as property sat down with a pen and a government form and described them not as people, but as agricultural assets. This is the story of finding what that man's pen tried to erase. It begins not in Atlanta, not in Washington, not at any of the landmarks that American memory has built around the King legacy, but in a place called the Bight of Benin, a crescent of coastline on the western edge of the African continent, where the ocean comes in warm and dark green, and the air smells of salt and red earth, and something older than any of the nation-states that now divide up that part of the world between them. It begins there, in the 17th century, when a political and spiritual civilization that had been developing for roughly 1,000 years was at the absolute peak of its complexity and power and beauty. And when, at exactly that moment of peak flourishing, the Atlantic slave trade arrived and began the process of converting that civilization's people into American labor. The timing is not incidental. It never is in this history. The trade did not pick up random stragglers from the margins of African society. It extracted people from the center of things, from cities, from courts, from the families of artists and priests and soldiers and merchants. The people who crossed the Atlantic in chains were not the periphery of their world. Many of them were its heart. And that heart, beating, surviving, refusing at the cellular level to be extinguished, is what we are tracing today. Let us go back to the beginning of the King family name, because the name itself is a door, And behind the door is a story that most of the biographies skip past in their rush to get to Montgomery, to Birmingham, to Memphis. King. It is, on its surface, an English word, a title, the highest secular title in the British monarchical tradition. And it was given, or taken, or assigned, or improvised, depending on which theory of Black American surname adoption you find most credible, to an enslaved family in Georgia sometime in the antebellum period. This is how African American surnames almost universally work. They are not ancestral names in the way that European surnames are ancestral names. They are adoption documents. They are the names of enslavers sometimes. They are aspirational titles sometimes: freedom, liberty, justice, king. They are the names of biblical figures. They are the names of American presidents. They are, in nearly every case, a name that was chosen or imposed at the moment of emancipation or during the slavery period itself, to replace a name that had been taken earlier and was now simply gone. The name that was replaced, the African name, the clan name, the lineage name, the name that connected a human being to their specific people and their specific place on the African continent. That name exists now only in the DNA, nowhere else. Every other record that might have carried it was either never created or has long since crumbled into the red Georgia dirt. Martin Luther King Sr., the man who would become the father of the civil rights icon, was born in 1897 in Stockbridge, a small town in Henry County, Georgia, about 30 miles south of Atlanta. His father was James Albert King. His mother was Delia Lindsay. James Albert King was the son of a man named Jim King, who appears in the post-Civil War Georgia records with the tentative, blinking quality of someone who has just stepped out of a very dark room into uncertain light. Jim King is findable in the 1870 census, just barely. He is listed as a black male farmer in Henry County, Georgia. He has an age somewhere in his 30s. He has a wife. He has children. He has the legal status of a person, which is a status he had not possessed 4 years earlier, when the 13th Amendment was still being negotiated in a Congress that was simultaneously trying to rebuild a country it had just finished destroying. Before 1870, Jim King does not appear in any named record. Before 1870, Jim King is a shadow in a slave schedule, a number in a column. He exists in the Federal Archive the way a photographic negative exists before it is developed. The information is there, the shape is there, the reality is there, but the light has not yet been applied that would make it visible to the human eye. The light we are about to apply is not metaphorical. It is genetic. It is the specific, measurable, reproducible science of human ancestry read from the double helix itself, from the biological record that no courthouse could alter, and no plantation owner could burn, and no census taker could reduce to a tick mark in a property ledger. But before we get there, before we arrive at the laboratory and the results and the specific revelation of which people, which kingdom, which coastal civilization produced the bloodline of the most important Black American of the 20th century, we need to spend some time in Henry County, Georgia, in 1860, because what happened there, in the texture of the daily reality of the people we are trying to find, matters in a way that a simple DNA percentage cannot fully convey. Henry County in 1860 is cotton country. The soil is the famous Georgia red clay, iron-rich, staining, the kind of dirt that gets into the creases of your hands and stays there. The county was organized around the plantation system with the particular efficiency that characterized Georgia's antebellum agricultural economy. The white landowning families, the Joneses, the Smiths, the McDaniels, the Walkers, held between them hundreds of enslaved people whose labor produced the cotton that produced the wealth that built the county courthouse and the white Methodist church on the square, and the Greek revival houses set back from the road behind lines of oak trees. The 1860 slave schedule for Henry County, Georgia, is a document of approximately 40 pages. It is held now in microfilm in the National Archives, and there is something about the physical experience of reading it on a microfilm reader. The slightly grainy reproduction, the way the handwriting shifts from one census taker's script to another's, the occasional ink blot or water stain that makes the abstraction of historical atrocity briefly, uncomfortably concrete. You are not reading about slavery. You are reading slavery. You are reading the actual mechanism of it, the paperwork, the administrative infrastructure of a system that required, to function, that human beings be transformed into ledger entries. The entries go like this: the name of the enslaver at the top of a section. Then, beneath it, a series of rows. Each row, a number indicating the enslaved person's age, a letter indicating sex, a letter indicating color, and 3 columns for disability status: deaf and dumb, blind, insane, or idiotic. That is it. That is the complete record. No name, no origin, no family relationship indicated, no acknowledgement that the person in one row might be the parent or child or spouse of the person in the next row. The family structures that enslaved people maintained, and they did maintain them fiercely under conditions that were specifically designed to make that maintenance difficult or impossible, are completely invisible in this document. A mother and her children appear as separate entries. A husband and wife appear as separate entries. Their love for each other, their knowledge of each other, their shared history and shared language and shared grief, none of it appears anywhere in the federal record. Somewhere in those 40 pages of the Henry County slave schedule, the ancestors of Martin Luther King Jr. are present. We cannot point to them with certainty. We cannot say, this entry, this specific row, this number and letter combination. This is the great-great-great-grandmother of the man who would one day tell America about his dream. The record doesn't allow that precision. The record was specifically designed to prevent that precision. What we can say is this: they were there, in Henry County, in 1860, working that red clay, speaking to each other in whatever hybrid of African languages and forced English had become the mother tongue of the enslaved community in that particular corner of Georgia, raising children under conditions of profound legal and physical vulnerability, burying their dead in unmarked graves in the corners of fields, praying to what exactly is one of the most fascinating questions in all of American religious history, because the Christianity that enslaved people practiced was never simply the Christianity of their enslavers, was never the uncomplicated acceptance of a theology that had been used as partial justification for their bondage, but was always something more syncretic, more layered, more resistant. The God of the Black Baptist Church in the American South is not the same God as the God of the white Southern slaveholder who read from the same Bible. The prayers sound similar on the surface. The hymns share melodies. But underneath, in the specific emotional register, in the particular urgency of the appeal, in the theology of liberation that runs through Black American Christianity like a river running under stone, there is something else entirely. Something that did not originate in Geneva or Canterbury or Rome. Something that came from the other side of the Atlantic. This is where the genetic investigation becomes inseparable from the cultural investigation. Because what the DNA reveals is not just a geographic origin. It is a context, a world, a set of intellectual and spiritual traditions that did not simply disappear when the ships left the African coast. They transformed, they adapted, they went partially underground and partially into the open air of a new world, and they kept living, kept evolving, kept shaping the interior life of the people who carried them, even when those people could no longer name what they were carrying, even when the specific words and rituals and cosmological frameworks had been stripped away by the violence of the Middle Passage and the further violence of the American plantation system. When Martin Luther King Jr. stood up to preach, when he found that extraordinary synthesis of prophetic Old Testament thunder and New Testament grace, when he reached for the cadences of Amos and Isaiah and bent them into something that felt simultaneously ancient and urgently present, he was doing something that his ancestors had been doing for 1,000 years before the first slave ship arrived on the West African coast. He just didn't know their names. We are about to learn them. The genetic analysis of King family lines, drawn from autosomal DNA testing, from mitochondrial haplogroup sequencing that traces the direct maternal line back through thousands of years of human migration, from Y chromosome analysis of the paternal line, produces results that are, even in a field accustomed to profound discoveries, striking in their specificity and their historical resonance. The maternal haplogroup, the direct line from mother to mother to mother, going back in an unbroken female chain from Alberta Williams King, Martin's mother, through her mother, Jenny Parks, through Jenny's mother, through the women before her whose names the slave schedule swallowed, traces back to a haplogroup that is found today in highest concentration among specific populations in West Africa, not broadly West African, specifically with the precision that the science of genetic genealogy has been refining for 2 decades, concentrated among people whose living descendants can be found today in a particular stretch of territory along the Gulf of Guinea. The autosomal results, the full mosaic of ancestry, drawing from both maternal and paternal lines and all the lines between, confirm and expand what the haplogroup suggests. And what they suggest is this: the family of Martin Luther King Jr. comes, in its deepest African roots, from people whose civilization was one of the intellectual and artistic wonders of the pre-colonial world. From people who organized their society around principles so sophisticated that European anthropologists in the 19th century, confronted with the evidence of that sophistication, preferred to invent impossible explanations rather than simply acknowledge what was in front of them. From people whose spiritual tradition did not end in the dungeon beneath the slave castle, but crossed the ocean and embedded itself, in transformed and surviving forms, into the very religious culture that produced the preacher who would one day become the moral conscience of the most powerful nation on earth. Before we name them, and we will name them precisely, with the full weight of their history behind the name, we need to understand something about the geography of the slave trade as it operated in the specific period when the ancestors of Martin Luther King Jr. were most likely taken. The peak years of the Atlantic slave trade's impact on the specific regions we are discussing fall between roughly 1650 and 1800. During this period, the coastal regions of what is now Nigeria and Ghana and Benin were not passive victims of an external force descending upon them from outside. The reality, and this is a reality that requires the full complexity it deserves, without either the simplification that exonerates Europeans by distributing blame evenly, or the simplification that ignores African agency entirely. The reality is that the trade operated through a network of relationships between European maritime powers and African political entities that were themselves often powerful, often calculating, and often making choices whose long-term consequences they could not fully anticipate. The Dahomean kingdom, which controlled significant stretches of the Bight of Benin coastline, became one of the most significant suppliers of captives to the Atlantic trade in the 18th century, raiding neighboring peoples, including Yoruba communities, and selling the captives to European traders at the coast. The Asante Empire, in the forest zone of present-day Ghana, similarly expanded in part through the slave trade, acquiring firearms from European traders in exchange for captives taken in wars of expansion. This history is not comfortable. It was not meant to be. The slave trade was not comfortable for anyone it touched, including the African societies it drew into its terrible economics. What it did to those societies, the way it militarized political life, the way it disrupted existing trade networks and social structures, the way it created a century-long incentive for inter-African conflict, is one of the most consequential and least discussed chapters in the entire story of Atlantic history. But here is what matters for the specific story we are telling. The people who were taken, the Yoruba captives sold by Dahomean raiders, the Akan men and women taken in the wars that the arms trade had incentivized, they did not arrive in Georgia as blank slates. They arrived as fully formed human beings, carrying inside them the complete archive of their civilization. Every song they knew, every proverb, every understanding of how the divine and the human relate to each other, every memory of their mothers' faces and their fathers' names. The archive was invisible to the men who bought and sold them. It was invisible to the census takers who recorded them as property. It was invisible, in many ways, to the descendants who carried it without knowing they were carrying it. But invisible is not the same as absent. And now, standing at the intersection of genetic science and archival history and cultural archaeology, we can finally begin to see what was always there. The DNA does not lie. After everything, after the slave schedules, after the blank columns where names should have been, after the generations of deliberate erasure written into the administrative architecture of American apartheid, the biological record remains intact, patient, waiting for the technology to catch up to the question. The maternal haplogroup of the King family line traces, with the precision that 2 decades of African genetic database building has made possible, to the Yoruba people of the Niger Delta region, to Ile-Ife, the sacred city, the place where Oduduwa descended from the heavens on a chain and created the world. The autosomal markers confirm Akan ancestry layered beneath, the forest people of the Gold Coast, the keepers of the Golden Stool. These were not peripheral people. These were the architects of civilizations that were ancient when America was not yet an idea in anyone's mind. And here is the thing that stops the breath completely if you let it. Martin Luther King Jr. spent his entire life preaching about a beloved community that had never been allowed to exist. He preached it from Ebenezer Baptist Church, which his grandfather built, which his father inherited, which he himself filled every Sunday with a voice that seemed to carry something older than its owner. He preached about justice descending like water, about the arc of the moral universe bending, about the content of character over the color of skin. The Yoruba have a concept, Ash, the divine power that moves through all living things, that ancestors pass forward to descendants, that cannot be purchased or legislated or taken by force. He was full of it. He always had been. He simply had no word for what it was. Now we do. The dream was never just American. It was older than America by 1,000 years. It crossed the Atlantic in a body that had no name in the ledger, and it survived everything that was done to silence it, and it arrived, finally, at a microphone on the steps of the Lincoln Memorial on an August afternoon, and it opened its mouth, and the whole world heard something it recognized without knowing why. Now we know why.